Bill Longley's most cowardly crime dismantles the myth of a fearless outlaw. Despite boasting to newspapers about executing 32 people to build his reputation, he strictly targeted unarmed civilians from behind. His violent narcissism earned him a 1,000 state bounty, but his execution was a mechanical failure. The hangman miscalculated the rope's length, allowing Longley's feet to hit the ground. Instead of a swift execution, authorities had to manually pull the rope upward, leaving the arrogant serial killer to slowly suffocate in front of a mocking crowd. This is the cold, physical reality of a coward. The wooden gallows erected in Giddings, Texas, on the morning of October 11, 1878, were not constructed with the clinical, engineered precision typical of a state-sanctioned execution. They were built rapidly and crudely, a functional mechanism designed simply to terminate the biological existence of a man who had spent the better part of a decade aggressively demanding the terrified attention of the American public. As the condemned man, William Preston Longley, climbed the rough wooden steps toward the platform, he desperately attempted to project the aura of a hardened, unrepentant outlaw. He was 27 years old, standing tall and heavily built, carrying a physical presence that he had weaponized throughout his short life. For months leading up to this final moment, sitting in a dark, heavily guarded jail cell, he had relentlessly written letters to regional newspapers, meticulously crafting his own mythological persona. He had proudly and arrogantly declared to the press that he was a wolf, and that the execution day was merely his night to howl. He had claimed a staggering 32 men had fallen before his guns, a fabricated body count designed to elevate his own name above that of his contemporary, the legendary John Wesley Hardin, in the bloody pantheon of Texas killers. But the theater of the gallows is fundamentally stripped of romance, and the mechanics of reality often possess a dark, ironic sense of justice that dismantles the narratives constructed by narcissists. When the local sheriff finally pulled the heavy iron lever and the wooden trapdoor swung open with a violent, echoing crack, Bill Longley dropped into the void, but he did not drop far enough. The amateur executioner tasked with the hanging had critically miscalculated both the length of the thick hemp rope and the elasticity of the drop required for a man of Longley's specific weight. Instead of experiencing the sudden merciful snap of the cervical vertebrae that severs the spinal cord and brings instantaneous death, Longley's heavy leather boots hit the solid dirt beneath the platform. He found himself standing on the ground, the thick noose pulling agonizingly tight around his trachea, while a massive crowd of thousands watched the spectacle in stunned, horrified silence. The self-proclaimed deadliest wolf in Texas did not die a sudden glorious outlaw's death. The local sheriff, panicking at the spectacularly botched procedure and the absolute failure of the state's apparatus, was forced to scramble back onto the wooden platform, grab the thick rope with his bare hands, and physically haul it upward, lifting Longley's struggling body off the dirt. Longley hung there in the dry Texas air, slowly strangling. He kicked his legs wildly, his face turning a deep, congested purple, violently fighting for the oxygen his brain was being denied. It took 11.5 agonizing minutes of slow asphyxiation before his heart finally gave out. It was a pathetic, squalid, and entirely humiliating physical conclusion to a life defined by unearned arrogance. The physical reality of his death ultimately mirrored his life, dismantling the mythology he so desperately tried to manufacture. Stripped of the fearless gunfighter persona, historical records indicate a pattern of extreme violence directed exclusively at the vulnerable. He built his terrifying body count from the shadows of the brush, hunting individuals incapable of defending themselves. Longley operated entirely outside the romanticized parameters of the honorable frontier duelist. His descent into serial murder lacked the pragmatic motives of territorial disputes or organized robbery. Modern historians suggest his actions were driven by a profound need to assert dominance over defenseless targets, a brutal exertion of power he could not achieve in any legitimate aspect of a rapidly changing society. This psychological architecture was heavily forged in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the American Civil War. Longley was born in 1851 in Austin County, Texas, growing up in a society built entirely upon a rigid racial hierarchy. He was an impressionable teenager when the Confederacy collapsed, plunging Texas into the deeply bitter, economically devastated era of Reconstruction. The established social order of his childhood was completely and violently dismantled. The sudden emancipation of enslaved people and the looming presence of federal occupation troops created an environment of intense, suffocating racial anxiety, economic panic, and deep resentment among the defeated white population. For a young man with a naturally volatile temperament, a profound lack of empathy, and a deep-seated inability to adhere to personal discipline, this highly combustible social climate provided a convenient, highly lethal outlet. Longley did not possess the intellect, the work ethic, or the charisma required to succeed or rebuild in the rapidly changing agricultural economy of post-war Texas. He felt powerless, insignificant, and entirely overshadowed by the shifting political dynamics that were stripping away the unearned advantages of his birth. He discovered, however, that he could instantly manufacture a feeling of absolute, terrifying power by inflicting extreme violence upon the newly freed African American population. Bypassing standard gunfights over gambling debts or cattle disputes, his initial foray into murder manifested strictly as an act of calculated racial terrorism designed to soothe his own fragile ego. In late 1868, when he was just 17 years old, Longley and a small group of associates intercepted 3 freedmen traveling on a rural, isolated road in Washington County. The victims were unarmed, non-combative, and completely vulnerable. Completely ignoring robbery or honorable physical combat, he operated from a position of absolute, unthreatened superiority by simply raising his weapon and opening fire. He shot the men down in the dirt, killing one instantly and leaving the others severely wounded, bleeding on the roadside. When later pressed to justify this unprovoked slaughter, Longley did not cite any political ideology or claim self-defense. He chillingly stated that the men had been sassy or disrespectful. This early horrific act established the immutable, cowardly blueprint for his entire criminal career. He learned in that moment that pulling a trigger against a defenseless target provided an intoxicating, immediate surge of absolute authority. For the brief seconds it took a man to die at his hands, Longley was no longer a failing, uneducated farm boy in a defeated, occupied state. He was the ultimate arbiter of life and death. He weaponized the prevailing systemic racial hatred of the era, not out of any genuine allegiance to a political cause, but strictly as a psychological shield. By targeting individuals the fractured society deemed expendable, he utilized the chaotic prejudice of Reconstruction to validate his own sociopathic urge to kill without facing immediate legal consequence. He realized that the fractured legal system of Reconstruction Texas was largely indifferent to the murder of freedmen, effectively granting him a hunting license. Instead of viewing his victims as human beings with agency, families, or rights, he treated them exclusively as disposable biological props, required for his own dark theater of self-aggrandizement. The act of killing became a narcotic, a necessary action to stave off the crushing reality of his own inadequacy. Every time the trigger was pulled, the loud report of the firearm served to silence the internal voice that recognized his fundamental weakness. Far from a man driven by the wild spirit of the frontier, this behavioral pattern exposes a nascent serial killer actively discovering his preferred methodology. He was realizing that true power in his twisted arithmetic did not come from a fair fight. It came from total domination, from ensuring the victim never even had the chance to raise a hand in defense. He had tasted the absolute control of unprovoked murder, and as the societal structures of Texas continued to burn around him, he prepared to escalate his localized terror, seeking out new environments where his specific brand of cowardly violence could flourish without the interference of a functioning justice system. The most damning forensic evidence of Bill Longley's inherent cowardice and his fundamental inability to function in a structured, combative environment is found not in the exaggerated newspaper articles he later authored, but in his disastrous, largely buried military record. The mythology of the Western outlaw heavily relies on the archetype of the fiercely independent warrior, a man who is simply too dangerous and too unyielding to be tamed by civilized society. If Bill Longley truly possessed the heart of a warrior and the fearless disposition of a gunfighter, the military would have provided a sanctioned, highly structured theater for his aggression. In 1870, actively fleeing local arrest warrants for his escalating, racially motivated violence in Texas, Longley crossed state lines and traveled north. He made a decision that would permanently expose the fragile reality of his bravado. He enlisted in the United States Cavalry in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The reality of the U.S. cavalry on the western frontier in 1870 was brutally demanding. It required absolute discipline, intense physical endurance, and a willingness to engage in fair, tactical combat against highly skilled, heavily armed indigenous forces. It was an environment designed to mold men into cohesive fighting units capable of standing on a firing line while receiving incoming fire. Longley's psychological profile was entirely incompatible with this reality. He possessed zero capacity for subordination, and more critically, the military structure stripped away his primary operational advantage. He was no longer a predator hunting unarmed victims on isolated dirt roads. He was a soldier expected to face combatants on equal terms. When confronted with the prospect of actual warfare, where the opposing force possessed the weaponry and the intent to kill him, Longley's nerve disintegrated entirely. He could not tolerate the discipline, and he was physically and psychologically incapable of facing a fair fight. Within a matter of months, the self-proclaimed deadliest man in Texas committed one of the most heavily penalized offenses in the military apparatus. He deserted his post. He abandoned his unit, discarded his uniform, and attempted to flee. However, the United States Army did not operate with the sluggish inefficiency of rural Texas law enforcement. They pursued him, tracked him down, and captured him. Longley was dragged back in irons and subjected to a military court-martial. The tribunal stripped him of any remaining dignity, sentencing him to 2 years of hard labor in the federal military prison at Camp Stambaugh. The prison environment was one of crushing labor and absolute control, completely neutralizing his manufactured persona of the untouchable wolf. After serving a fraction of his sentence due to administrative decisions within the regiment, he was inexplicably returned to active duty with his unit. A man possessing actual resilience or a desire to prove his worth might have utilized this second chance to fulfill his obligations. Longley, however, demonstrated that his cowardice was congenital. Almost immediately after being reintegrated into his unit, he deserted a second time. This time, he successfully evaded federal capture, scurrying back toward the chaotic, familiar landscape of the southern states. This official military ledger is the ultimate forensic artifact destroying his myth. Shattering the warrior archetype, he responded to the United States government's order to stand his ground against armed men by fleeing twice. Upon his return to Texas, his ego severely bruised by his humiliating military failure, Longley desperately needed to reassert his dominance. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not win a fair, face-to-face gunfight against a skilled opponent. Therefore, he consciously and meticulously refined his methodology of murder to absolutely minimize personal risk. This tactical shift is most clearly evidenced by his primary choice of weaponry. The defining image of the Western outlaw is the Colt single-action revolver. To utilize a revolver effectively in a lethal encounter requires precise aim, a steady hand under extreme psychological pressure, and inherently demands physical proximity to the target. To win a gunfight with a six-shooter, you must stand in front of a man, look him in the eye, and pull the trigger while he is actively attempting to do the exact same thing to you. Bill Longley outright rejected this weapon for his premeditated assassinations. He heavily favored the double-barreled shotgun. From a forensic and tactical standpoint, the shotgun is a devastating, indiscriminate tool. When loaded with heavy buckshot, it requires virtually no marksmanship. It does not require the user to control their breathing or maintain a steady hand. At close range, it delivers catastrophic, inescapable kinetic trauma. The heavy lead pellets spread outward, destroying massive amounts of tissue, shattering bone, and guaranteeing immediate physiological incapacitation. It is a weapon designed to obliterate a target without the need for precision. But more importantly, the shotgun is the ultimate weapon of the ambush. It allowed Longley to execute his preferred tactical maneuver, the bushwhack. Refusing to step out of saloons to challenge men in the street, he heavily favored concealing himself within the dense brush, behind heavy timber, or in the shadows of physical structures along isolated transit routes. He would wait patiently for his specific target to pass his position. He issued no warnings. He did not demand a draw. He simply leveled the twin barrels at the back of his unsuspecting victim and pulled the triggers. This method completely eliminated the variable of return fire. He hunted human beings with the exact same detached, cowardly mechanics a trapper uses to execute a wounded animal caught in a snare. It required absolutely no courage, only a complete absence of human empathy and a willingness to shoot a man who was looking the other way. The shotgun allowed him to inflict maximum lethal damage while remaining entirely concealed, guaranteeing that his own life was never placed in jeopardy. Armed with this indiscriminate weapon and a renewed, desperate, psychological need to prove his superiority after his military disgrace, Longley prepared to unleash a wave of localized terror across the Texas frontier. The subsequent murders he committed would not be duels of honor. They would be a series of calculated, cold-blooded executions that provided the undeniable forensic data to prove he was nothing more than a serial killer hiding behind a wide-brimmed hat. The theoretical cowardice of the double-barreled shotgun materialized into brutal forensic reality upon Bill Longley's return to the fractured landscape of Texas. The meticulous examination of his victimology reveals a chilling, undeniable pattern that completely destroys the cinematic illusion of the honorable frontier outlaw. Longley did not seek out the strongest adversaries to prove his courage. He systematically selected the absolute weakest. He exclusively targeted individuals who were geographically isolated, physically engaged in demanding labor, and biologically or situationally incapable of recognizing or responding to an immediate lethal threat. His methodology was not combat, it was agricultural slaughter. This cowardly doctrine is perfectly encapsulated in the premeditated murder of Wilson Anderson in March of 1875. The historical pretext for the killing was rooted in a localized blood feud. Anderson had allegedly been involved in the death of Longley's cousin, Caleb. The Hollywood script for such a scenario demands a tense face-to-face confrontation in the center of a dusty town, a high-noon settlement of family honor. Longley's execution of the event was entirely devoid of honor. He tracked Anderson not to a saloon, but to a remote, deeply isolated farming plot. Anderson was in the middle of a massive, exhausting physical exertion. He was driving a heavy iron plow behind a team of mules, his hands firmly gripping the wooden handles, his attention entirely focused on the hard Texas earth and the massive animals pulling the rig. The loud rhythmic jingling of the harness chains, the heavy snorting of the mules, and the grinding of the iron blade through the soil created a localized auditory blind spot. Longley recognized this profound tactical advantage. He did not announce his presence. He crept quietly into the thick brush lining the edge of the field, raised his heavy shotgun, and waited until the farmer's back was squarely presented in his sights. He pulled the triggers. The massive spread of buckshot tore through Wilson Anderson's back, destroying his internal organs and shattering his spine. Anderson died bleeding in the freshly turned dirt, his hands likely still gripping the plow handles when the kinetic shock hit him. Longley had successfully avenged his cousin without ever having to look the killer in the eye. This exact paradigm of extreme cowardice was repeated in June of 1876 in Delta County, further confirming the pathological nature of his violence. The target was the Reverend William R. Lay. The dispute between the two men was remarkably trivial, reportedly stemming from an argument over a horse and the Reverend's peripheral involvement in a local posse that had previously attempted to arrest Longley. The Reverend Lay was not a gunfighter, nor was he actively hunting Longley at the time. When Longley decided to execute him, he did not ride to the local church to issue a public challenge. He stalked the minister to his own property and waited for the man to engage in the most mundane, vulnerable chore imaginable. The Reverend Lay was inside his barn, sitting on a low wooden stool, actively milking a cow. To understand the sheer sadism of this execution, one must analyze the physical biomechanics of the victim. Lay was seated, his center of gravity completely locked. Both of his hands were occupied. His posture was inherently docile and completely immobile. He was a stationary, defenseless target trapped in an enclosed space. Longley stepped into the barn with his shotgun and fired a devastating blast of heavy lead at point-blank range. The buckshot obliterated the minister, ending his life before he could even register the presence of the threat, let alone attempt to stand up or defend himself. Throughout his entire blood-soaked career across the Texas frontier, there is only one historically verifiable instance where Bill Longley engaged in an actual two-sided gunfight against a capable adversary, and the forensic fallout from that encounter perfectly explains why he never did it again. In January of 1876, in Uvalde County, Longley unexpectedly crossed paths with a man named Lou Schroyer. Schroyer was not a farmer or a minister. He was a hardened, heavily armed outlaw who thoroughly understood the mechanics of violence. This was not a planned ambush by Longley. It was a sudden, forced confrontation that rapidly escalated out of his control. When the shooting commenced, Schroyer did not freeze or run. He drew his own weapons and immediately returned heavy, accurate fire. For the first time in his life, Longley experienced the terrifying sensory overload of incoming lead. He was forced to process the deafening cracks of a revolver aimed directly at him and the terrifying whistle of bullets passing inches from his face. Schroyer's return fire was highly effective. He shot Longley's horse out from under him, sending the massive animal crashing into the dirt and pinning Longley momentarily. Bullets tore through Longley's clothing, grazing his skin and physically demonstrating his own extreme vulnerability. Through sheer desperate luck and frantic return fire, Longley managed to shoot and kill Schroyer. But the psychological impact of the encounter was profound and permanent. The gunfight terrified him to his core. It definitively proved to his fragile ego that facing an armed, capable man was a chaotic, unpredictable gamble where his survival was absolutely not guaranteed. He had nearly been killed, and the visceral fear he experienced during that exchange permanently cemented his reliance on the shotgun and the ambush. He never engaged in a fair fight again. Instead, Longley escalated the psychological cruelty of his ambushes. He did not merely want to kill his victims, he wanted to cultivate a paralyzing regional terror to inflate his own mythological status. To achieve this, he frequently executed his victims in the immediate presence of their families, specifically targeting the psychological destruction of women and young children. This was not accidental collateral damage. It was a highly calculated public relations strategy. A dead man buried in the dirt tells no tales, but a traumatized widow screaming over a bloody corpse or a terrified child who has just witnessed their father's skull shattered by buckshot, becomes a powerful localized broadcast system for the killer's reputation. Longley fed off the physical fear he saw in the eyes of the survivors. He utilized their severe psychological trauma to build his mythological status, ensuring that the mere mention of his name evoked a visceral, paralyzing dread across the county lines. He was a terrorist who recognized that the horror of the witnesses was the most effective mechanism for amplifying his own perceived power. A precise analysis of the operational reality defining Bill Longley's flight from justice inevitably shifts from his psychological cowardice to the brutal mathematical economics of the late 19th century Texas frontier. The state apparatus did not pursue Longley merely out of a localized desire for moral justice. They hunted him because his escalating chaotic violence had become a severe economic liability to the region's agricultural and commercial stability. Consequently, the state explicitly monetized his capture, transforming his life into a highly lucrative financial asset. In the mid-1870s, as Longley's body count and his accompanying boastful letters to the press continued to rise, the state of Texas officially placed a massive 1,000 bounty on his head. To contextually understand the sheer gravitational pull of this sum, one must examine the economic baseline of the era. A standard labor-intensive ranching wage in Texas during this period hovered around $20 to $30 a month. The bounty represented roughly 3 years of grueling, uninterrupted agricultural labor, payable in hard currency. This staggering financial incentive completely altered the geographical landscape for Longley. He was no longer just dodging local sheriffs. He had effectively weaponized the entire civilian population against himself. Every drifting cowboy, every impoverished farmer, and every former associate was mathematically incentivized to calculate the exact exchange rate of Longley's life. The 1,000 bounty created an environment of suffocating total paranoia. Longley could no longer trust the isolated farmhouses he used for shelter or the men he drank with in rural saloons. The very people he had previously terrorized or attempted to recruit were now heavily subsidized to betray him. The bounty system proved that in the ruthless economy of the frontier, loyalty was a highly volatile commodity, and the state of Texas had just aggressively outbid any loyalty Longley could command. This intense, omnipresent financial pressure forced him into increasingly desperate, erratic movements, completely stripping away his illusion of untouchable power and ultimately driving him directly into the hands of the authorities waiting in Louisiana. He was brought down not by a legendary gunfight, but by the cold, inescapable arithmetic of a corporate-level bounty. Eventually, the sheer volume of his disorganized crimes, combined with the slowly stabilizing political and legal landscape of Texas, caught up with him. The era of unchecked Reconstruction violence was drawing to a close, replaced by a formalized state apparatus demanding order. In 1877, relying on the sophisticated tracking methods of the newly reorganized Texas Rangers and local law enforcement, Longley was finally captured in DeSoto Parish, Louisiana. He was heavily shackled, extradited back to Texas, and thrown into a massive iron cage in the Giddings jail to await trial for capital murder. Stripped of his double-barreled shotgun, his fast horses, and his ability to hide in the deep brush, Longley was forced to confront his ultimate paralyzing terror: total irrelevance. The heavy iron bars completely neutralized his physical power and his ability to inflict violence. Confined to a small, dark space, facing the absolute certainty of the gallows, his pathological narcissism violently mutated. He desperately pivoted to the only weapon he had left at his disposal: the printing press. Longley transformed his jail cell into a dedicated propaganda firm. He realized that the American public, sitting safely in their parlors in the eastern cities, possessed a dark, morbid fascination with the extreme violence of the western frontier. They were hungry for stories of blood and gunpowder, and Longley actively, aggressively fed this appetite. He began writing extensive, highly sensationalized letters to newspapers across the state, most notably establishing a steady correspondence with the editors of the Giddings Tribune. In these letters, he attempted to completely rewrite his own history. He presented himself not as a cowardly bushwhacker who shot unarmed farmers in the back, but as a tragic, romantic anti-hero, a victim of circumstance forced to kill by the corrupt political machinery of the state. He spun elaborate, fictionalized tales of grand gunfights and honorable duels that never occurred. But the absolute core of his written correspondence, the foundation upon which he attempted to build his immortal legacy, was a desperate, numerical lie. In his letters to the press, Longley explicitly and repeatedly claimed to have murdered 32 men. Modern historical and forensic verification can only definitively link him to perhaps 5 to 8 actual murders, almost all of which were cowardly ambushes. This massive fabricated inflation of his body count was driven by a specific, consuming, and deeply pathetic jealousy. At the exact moment Longley was sitting in the Giddings jail, another Texas killer was dominating the national headlines: John Wesley Hardin. Hardin was widely recognized as the undisputed king of the frontier gunmen. Hardin, despite his own brutal sociopathic pathology and deep-seated racism, had actually faced down armed men, local sheriffs, and federal troops in open combat. Longley knew in the darkest corners of his own mind that he was an absolute coward compared to Hardin. He knew he lacked the nerve to stand in the street and draw a weapon against a man who was looking at him. To bridge this terrifying gap in reality, and to satiate his desperate need to be remembered as the deadliest man alive, Longley simply inflated his numbers on paper. He engaged in a pathetic, unilateral competition of egos, from behind the safety of iron bars, attempting to write himself into the history books through sheer fabrication. He wanted the public to fear him more than they feared Hardin, hoping that a massive fictional body count would permanently mask the cowardly methodology of his actual crimes. What Longley completely failed to realize, blinded by his own towering narcissism and his desperate thirst for infamy, was that his letters were being carefully archived. He did not understand that his desperate need for public validation was systematically constructing the legal scaffolding for his own execution. He was gleefully publishing full, written confessions to capital crimes in the regional newspapers. The state prosecutors did not need to hunt for elusive witnesses or rely on circumstantial evidence to secure the death penalty. They simply read the morning paper, utilizing Longley's own desperate, ego-driven propaganda to definitively seal his fate on the gallows. The psychological facade of the untouchable outlaw, meticulously constructed through months of arrogant newspaper correspondence, completely disintegrated as the reality of the calendar began to close in on Bill Longley. When the Texas Court of Appeals definitively upheld his death sentence and the execution date of October 11, 1878, was formalized, the loud, boasting persona of the frontier wolf vanished entirely. The cold, damp isolation of the Giddings jail cell forced Longley to confront the absolute, inescapable mathematics of his situation. The state apparatus was not a frightened farmer in a field. It was a massive, unrelenting machine preparing to terminate his biological existence, and he possessed absolutely no tactical advantage against it. In the final weeks of his life, the letters dispatched from his cell underwent a radical and pathetic transformation. He stopped writing to the journalists to inflate his mythological kill count. Instead, he began writing desperate, groveling appeals to the highest political authorities in the state, specifically targeting Texas Governor Richard Hubbard. These letters constitute the ultimate forensic proof of his foundational cowardice. Abandoning the stoic defiance of a man willing to accept the consequences of a violent life, he wrote with the panicked, bargaining desperation of a terrified child. He completely abandoned the narrative of the righteous avenger. He attempted to rewrite his entire criminal history, claiming that he was merely a victim of the chaotic, volatile era of Reconstruction, swept up in violent socio-political currents entirely beyond his control. He blamed his youth, his environment, and the bad influence of his associates. The man who had proudly bragged about murdering 32 people now claimed his actions were simply unfortunate misunderstandings. When these excuses failed to generate a response, Longley escalated his bargaining to a level of profound hypocrisy. He reached out to his wealthy uncle, William Longley, begging him to leverage his significant financial and political capital to purchase a pardon or engineer an escape. Furthermore, Longley officially petitioned the governor with an astonishing offer. He volunteered to join the Texas Rangers. The man who had spent a decade murdering people who could not fight back and who had violently despised the establishment of state law now offered to pin on a badge and hunt down his former associates in exchange for his own life. He was entirely willing to become a state-sanctioned assassin if it meant avoiding the gallows. He possessed absolutely no loyalty to any code, any gang, or any ideology. His only genuine allegiance was to his own survival. Governor Hubbard, however, was not reading dime novels. He was reviewing the objective, physical evidence compiled by the courts. The file on William Preston Longley was a meticulous ledger of back shootings, ambushes, and the slaughter of unarmed civilians. It contained no evidence of military valor or honorable combat. Recognizing that granting clemency to a prolific serial killer would be political suicide and an insult to the foundational concept of frontier justice, Governor Hubbard categorically denied every single appeal. The state machinery continued its steady mechanical march toward the execution date. The morning of the execution exposed the final devastating isolation of Longley's existence. He had spent months writing letters, desperately trying to build an immortal mythology and a captive audience. Yet, when the day finally arrived, the most glaring absence in the massive crowd of thousands was his own bloodline. The Longley family, horrified Exhausted and deeply humiliated by his relentless, cowardly slaughter, refused to attend the spectacle. His own father, a respected pillar of the community, had publicly condemned his son's actions. Longley's desperate narcissism demanded an audience of mourners, but his actions had successfully alienated the only people who might have genuinely grieved him. He climbed the steps of the gallows entirely alone, surrounded not by a loving family, but by a hostile, morbid crowd of strangers who had purchased a train ticket strictly to watch him die. When the trapdoor finally swung open, the resulting mechanical failure instantly and permanently shattered any remaining cinematic illusion surrounding the outlaw's demise. Plunged directly into that grueling physiological nightmare of slow strangulation, Longley's body reacted with violent, involuntary biological panic. As he hung there in the unforgiving Texas heat, his bound hands completely unable to relieve the crushing pressure on his trachea, the narrative focus shifted from the mechanics of the gallows to the sheer horror of the audience. The massive crowd, specifically including his deeply traumatized 10-year-old niece, found themselves paralyzed by the gruesome spectacle. Instead of witnessing the glorious, defiant departure of a frontier legend, they were forced to watch a terrified man violently kicking and choking to death in the dust. It served as a squalid, agonizingly prolonged conclusion that flawlessly mirrored the exact cowardly, suffocating violence he had ruthlessly inflicted upon his unsuspecting victims. Deconstructing the legacy of Bill Longley requires looking past the physical horror of his asphyxiation to analyze the highly lucrative, deeply cynical economic event that his death be. The execution on October 11, 1878, was not conducted as a solemn, dignified administration of state justice. It was aggressively commercialized, functioning as a massive, macabre economic stimulus package for Lee County. As the execution date approached, the local infrastructure heavily capitalized on the public's morbid curiosity. Regional railroad companies actively monetized the bloodshed by scheduling special excursion trains, running additional lines specifically to transport thousands of spectators from surrounding counties directly into Giddings. Local saloons, boarding houses, and dry goods merchants experienced unprecedented, record-breaking daily revenue spikes. Longley's highly publicized narcissism had successfully drawn a massive crowd, but the ultimate financial beneficiaries of his notoriety were the local capitalists who charged the public a premium for food, transport, and alcohol to watch him die. He was entirely reduced to a violent tourist attraction. Furthermore, the refusal of Governor Richard Hubbard to grant clemency was not driven solely by a moral obligation to Longley's victims. It was a heavily calculated geopolitical corporate strategy. In the late 1870s, the state of Texas was desperately attempting to attract massive influxes of Eastern capital and European investments to fund the expansion of lucrative railroad networks and massive cattle syndicates. However, corporate investors require absolute fiduciary stability, and the chaotic, unchecked vigilantism of the Reconstruction era was terrifying major financial institutions. To secure this vital corporate capital, the state of Texas needed to definitively prove to Wall Street that it had established an absolute, unyielding monopoly on violence. Executing a high-profile, notoriously boastful white serial killer like Bill Longley was the ultimate, highly visible public relations maneuver. The gallows in Giddings effectively function as a state-sponsored billboard, broadcasting a clear clinical message to global investors. The era of the untouchable frontier outlaw was officially dead, and the state government was now powerful enough to physically crush any liability that threatened commercial stability. Longley was not merely hanged for his crimes, he was strategically sacrificed on the altar of state building to secure Texas's corporate bond ratings. The ultimate absolute humiliation of his legacy occurred in the frantic minutes immediately following his botched execution. As his lifeless body was finally cut down from the ropes, the massive crowd did not disperse in respectful silence. They surged forward, driven by a perverse consumerist frenzy. The spectators actively sought to harvest physical souvenirs of the spectacle. The thick hemp rope that had slowly strangled him was immediately seized, cut into dozens of small pieces, and distributed or sold as highly coveted macabre commodities. The self-proclaimed deadliest wolf in Texas, the man who had desperately written letters to the press to ensure he was feared as an immortal legend, was instantly physically fragmented and liquidated by the free market. His most lasting, immediate legacy was not fear or respect, but a few inches of frayed, bloody rope sitting in the pockets of strangers who had paid a train fare specifically to watch him choke. However, the human psyche, particularly the collective consciousness of the American public in the late 19th century, possessed a deep, inherent resistance to accepting such a pathetic conclusion to a highly publicized narrative. The public had been heavily fed a steady diet of romanticized outlaw mythology, and a botched hanging did not fit the established literary formula. Almost immediately after Longley was pronounced dead and buried in the local Giddings cemetery, a massive, persistent rumor began to circulate throughout the territory. The rumor dictated that the entire execution had been a highly sophisticated, financially orchestrated theater. The conspiracy theory claimed that Longley's wealthy uncle had successfully bribed the local sheriff, the executioner, and the attending physicians. The narrative insisted that the rope had been specifically rigged with a hidden harness to prevent fatal injury, or that the body in the coffin was an elaborate fake. The rumor asserted that Bill Longley had survived the gallows, slipped away in the chaos, and had successfully escaped to Central or South America, where he lived out the remainder of his days as a wealthy, untouchable rancher. For over a century, this myth persisted, deeply embedded in the folklore of Texas. It survived because the public desperately wanted to believe that the cunning outlaw was always one step ahead of the lumbering machinery of the state. The myth provided a cinematic escape hatch, allowing the legend of the invincible wolf to survive the undeniable reality of the hangman's noose. The ultimate devastating destruction of this manufactured myth did not occur through historical debate. It occurred through the cold, absolute certainty of modern forensic science. The dime novels and the whispered rumors were finally subjected to the uncompromising scrutiny of a laboratory. In the year 2001, local historians and forensic anthropologists initiated a highly organized project to locate and exhume the remains of Bill Longley. The Giddings cemetery had changed significantly over the century, and the exact location of the unmarked grave had been lost to time. Utilizing ground-penetrating radar and historical burial maps, the forensic team successfully identified a specific plot containing a casket matching the dimensions and the historical timeline of the 1878 execution. The exhumation process was meticulous. The wooden casket had largely deteriorated, but the skeletal remains within were relatively intact. The skull provided immediate, compelling physical evidence. Forensic anthropologists identified specific cranial features and physical markers consistent with a man of Longley's age, height, and heavy build. Furthermore, they identified potential cervical trauma consistent with a hanging, though the degradation of the bone made visual confirmation alone insufficient to completely silence the conspiracy theories. The final, undeniable verdict required a biological match. The forensic team carefully extracted highly degraded genetic material from the pulp cavity of one of the skeleton's intact teeth. This material was transported to a state-of-the-art DNA laboratory where scientists utilized advanced polymerase chain reaction techniques to amplify and sequence the mitochondrial DNA. To establish a definitive biological link, the scientists required a living relative. They located Helen Longley, a direct descendant of Bill Longley's family line, and obtained a DNA sample. The resulting forensic comparison completely and permanently annihilated the century-old myth of the South American escape. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the tooth in the Giddings grave was an absolute scientifically undeniable match to the living descendant. The biological ledger was closed. The remains in the dirt were definitively those of William Preston Longley. He had not outsmarted the sheriff. He had not bribed his way to freedom. He had not lived a long, comfortable life in exile. The DNA confirmation provided the ultimate historical indictment of his entire existence. The man who had spent his life terrorizing the defenseless, who had hidden in the brush with a shotgun, and who had desperately attempted to write himself into the history books as a fearless warrior, was proven to have died exactly as the objective historical record indicated, choking, thrashing, and terrified at the end of a poorly measured rope. Bill Longley is the ultimate forensic proof that the loudest, most boastful figures of the American frontier were frequently the most deeply flawed and cowardly. Rather than a romantic Western ballad of rebellion and honor, his legacy endures as a pathological case study of a deeply insecure serial killer, a man who utilized extreme cowardly violence to mask his own impotence and who was ultimately reduced to a pile of bones in an unmarked grave, permanently stripped of his manufactured mythology by the cold, undeniable truth of a genetic sequence.